before fear learned the streets by heart. This town believed in itself with a quiet confidence that never felt like arrogance. It was the kind of place people described with a single phrase and meant it as a complete explanation. Nothing ever happens here. Not because nothing could happen, but because nothing ever had. That distinction mattered. It shaped how people lived, how they raised their children, how they left doors unlocked without a second thought. The town sat slightly removed from anything loud or fast. No highways cut through it. No bright signs competed for attention. Life moved at a pace that allowed people to notice each other. Names were remembered. Faces were familiar. Children didn't belong to households so much as they belonged to the streets, the yards, the shared spaces between fences. If a child scraped a knee, any nearby adult could step in. If dinner ran late, it was assumed they were safe somewhere else, fed by someone who knew them just as well. Trust was not a decision here. It was an inheritance. Parents had grown up the same way they were raising their children now. Free-range days, long summers, scraped knees, and sunburns had healed on their own. They didn't see this freedom as negligence. They saw it as proof of health. Proof that the town was functioning the way it was supposed to. There were landmarks everyone recognized, not because they were impressive, but because they were dependable. The old hardware store that smelled like dust and oil. The diner where the coffee was always too hot and refilled without asking. The creek where children dared each other to jump across stones slick with moss. These places didn't just exist. They anchored memory. They told people where they were in the world. Even the shadows felt familiar. Trees cast them the same way every evening. Alleys stayed quiet, predictable. Darkness arrived gently, not with menace, but with routine. That sense of safety didn't come from ignorance. It came from repetition. Decades of ordinary days had trained the town to believe that the future would look exactly like the past. People locked up when they went on vacation, sure, but on a normal night, windows stayed open. Porch lights were decorative, not defensive. Children walked home alone not because parents didn't worry, but because worry had never been rewarded. Nothing bad had ever followed it. Concern felt unnecessary, almost indulgent. Even strangers didn't raise alarms. A new face was noticed, but not feared. Outsiders passed through occasionally, salesmen, contractors, families visiting relatives. But they were anomalies, not threats. The town's danger radar wasn't broken. It had simply never been needed. And because of that, it pointed outward by default. If something went wrong, the instinct was to look beyond the edges of the map. Trouble came from elsewhere. It didn't grow in the soil. It didn't wear familiar shoes or speak in known voices. That assumption wasn't born from cruelty or blindness. It was born from comfort. Comfort is persuasive that way. In 1973, the town still believed it was small enough to be understood. Problems had causes that could be named. Solutions existed somewhere close. People trusted that order would reassert itself, because it always had. That belief shaped the first response to loss. When initial disappearance unsettled routines, people clung harder to normalcy. They didn't want to imagine that the town itself had changed. They told themselves a child had wandered farther than expected, that maybe they'd been picked up by someone they knew. That confusion was temporary, because to admit otherwise meant admitting something much larger, that the town's greatest strength might also be its weakness. Trust made people generous, but it also made them careless. It made them assume patterns where there were none. It made them dismiss instincts that didn't fit the story they'd been telling themselves for generations. The streets hadn't changed, so how could the danger be real? Children continued to play outside, though closer to home now. Parents lingered at windows a little longer. Conversations shifted, but cautiously, as if speaking fear too loudly might summon it. Everyone watched each other more closely, but no one wanted to be the first to say what that watching implied. The town had rules, but they were unwritten. Don't accuse without proof. Don't gossip. Don't disrupt the peace unless you're absolutely sure there's a reason. Those rules had preserved harmony for years. Now they preserved silence. The idea that someone within the town could be responsible felt impossible, almost insulting. These were people who attended the same church, shopped at the same stores, waved from their cars. Monsters belonged to stories, not neighborhoods. Evil wore masks, not familiar faces. And so suspicion drifted outward, away from what was known and comfortable. Attention focused on the roads leading in and out of town, on unfamiliar vehicles, on anyone who didn't fit neatly into the community's mental map. That focus offered relief. It gave fear direction. It allowed people to believe that if they just watched closely enough, they could spot the threat before it returned. Meanwhile, the town continued to function because it had no language for collapse. Businesses opened. Schools held classes. Life went on, though with a tremor running beneath it. The trust that once felt like a blanket now felt thin, worn in places. Still present, but no longer enough. Parents began imposing rules they'd never needed before. Come home before dark. Stay together. Tell someone where you're going. Each rule felt like a small betrayal to freedom they'd been proud to give their children. But they told themselves it was temporary. A precaution, not a transformation. They didn't know yet that the town they were protecting no longer existed. What they were guarding was a memory. The places that had once felt safe now carried an undercurrent of unease. The creek still ran. The diner still served coffee. But something invisible had shifted. Familiarity began to feel like exposure instead of comfort. Knowing someone well no longer guaranteed knowing them fully. The town's identity had been built on the idea that closeness equaled safety. That belief had gone unchallenged for so long it had hardened into truth. Now, that truth was beginning to crack. But cracks are easy to ignore when you're used to solid ground. People told themselves that nothing fundamental had changed, that the town was still the same place it had always been, that this was an interruption, not a revelation. They clung to the version of themselves that didn't need to be afraid, because if the danger wasn't outside, if it wasn't passing through, then it had to be somewhere much harder to face. It had to be embedded. And that was a thought the town was not yet ready to survive. The second disappearance did not arrive like a shock. It arrived like confirmation. By the time the town realized another child had not come home, the fear was already waiting. It didn't need to be invited in. It had been pacing just outside the door since the first night, listening, learning the rhythm of the place. This time, no one assumed the child was simply late. No one smiled nervously and suggested patience. Phones rang faster. Voices shook sooner. The name was spoken with urgency, carried down streets by people who no longer pretended this was routine. The search began before nightfall, and it was louder now, more desperate. Flashlights appeared earlier, beams slicing through hedges and alleys with purpose. Parents called out names until their throats burned, stopping only to listen for a response that never came. When darkness fell, it felt heavier than before, not just because another child was gone, but because the town could no longer claim ignorance. One disappearance could be an accident. Two demanded explanation. They leaned against each other, forming the outline of something larger, something far more frightening. Still, people searched for reasons that didn't require belief in a pattern. Maybe the children had run away together. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe the town was being tested in some strange, temporary way. But hope, once bent, does not snap back easily. By the time a third child vanished, the town's optimism fractured completely. Fear stopped spiking and began spreading. It seeped into kitchens and classrooms, into casual conversations and quiet moments. It followed parents into sleep and woke with them in the morning. The searches grew larger, but they also grew more mechanical. People learned how to scan ground, how to walk in lines, how to call names without sounding panicked. They learned how to look for signs without knowing what signs they were looking for. And every time the search ended without answers, the town lost a little more of its voice. Children noticed a change before adults admitted it. Play became quieter. Games ended earlier. Laughter still happened, but it felt careful, as if joy itself might draw attention. Parents watched more closely now, counting heads instinctively, memorizing outfits, burning details into memory they prayed they'd never need. The fourth disappearance didn't make headlines outside the town, but inside it rewrote reality. This was no longer something that might stop. This was something that had found a rhythm. The town started to measure time differently, not by days or weeks, but by how long it had been since the last child vanished. Each morning carried an unspoken question. Would today be the day? Fear sharpened into vigilance. Curtains stayed open not for light, but for surveillance. Neighbors began watching each other in subtle, unacknowledged ways, not with suspicion, at least not yet, but with awareness. People noticed who was home, who was out, who drove where and when. Still, no one said what that meant. When the number reached 7, the town stopped pretending this was coincidence. 7 empty beds. 7 sets of parents who stopped answering the question, "How are you holding up?" 7 households wrapped in silence, so thick it seemed to leak into the street. By then, the fear had changed shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was dull, constant, exhausting. A low-grade terror that never fully retreated, even in daylight. The kind that makes every sound feel like a threat and every absence feel intentional. Search parties were now expected, not organized. People showed up automatically, as if pulled by instinct. Flashlights were kept near doors. Shoes stayed on by the bed. The town moved in a state of permanent readiness. And yet nothing changed. No evidence surfaced. No witnesses stepped forward. No bodies were found. The children didn't reappear. They didn't leave clues behind. It was as if they had stepped out of the world entirely. Rumors began to grow in the spaces where facts should have been. Stories about strange cars, about shadows near the woods, about someone seen watching from a distance. Each rumor provided momentary focus, then dissolved under scrutiny. The truth was more unsettling than any rumor. The town was being hurt by something it could not see. Parents stopped allowing sleepovers. Schools adjusted schedules. Teachers watched hallways more closely. Children were instructed, over and over, to stay together, to go straight home, to trust adults, but only certain ones, though no one could explain which. That contradiction lodged itself deep in the minds of the young. The world was safe, but also dangerous. People were trustworthy, but also not. Rules multiplied without clarity, and fear became something to manage rather than escape. Adults began to change too. Conversations grew clipped. Smiles didn't reach eyes. People flinched at unexpected sounds. Everyone felt watched, though no one could say by whom. And beneath it all was the knowledge that something was learning the town as thoroughly as the town was trying to protect itself. With each disappearance, the response came faster. But it also felt more futile. The town was running the same race over and over, expecting a different outcome. They searched the same places, asked the same questions, followed the same procedures. Hope became quieter. It didn't disappear, but it learned how to hide. When the 7th child failed to come home, there was no collective gasp, no sudden escalation. Instead, there was a heavy, resigned stillness. People moved into action because they had to, not because they believed it would work. That was the moment the town realized it was trapped inside something it did not understand. The disappearances were no longer events. They were a condition. Parents began to speak in conditional language. If they come back. If we find them. When this ends. Each word choice carried weight, revealing how belief was shifting beneath the surface. The town that once trusted itself now trusted routine instead. Do the searches. Follow the rules. Keep going. As if movement alone could keep despair at bay. But despair as patience. By the end of that year, the town felt older, heavier, as though time had thickened around it, slowing everything down. People stopped talking about the future in confident terms. Plans felt fragile. Assumptions felt dangerous. The streets were still there. The houses still stood. But something essential had been taken, something that couldn't be returned even if the children were. The town had lost its ability to believe that safety was permanent, and that loss, more than anything else, marked the true beginning of what would follow. Authority arrived in marked cars and pressed uniforms, carrying with it the promise of order. Sirens cut to the town's quiet streets, not as alarms but as reassurance. To many, their presence felt like relief, proof that something concrete was finally happening, that the chaos of fear could be translated into checklists and procedures. Clipboards appeared. Maps were unfolded on the hoods of cars. The disappearances were pinned down with dates, times, last seen locations. The town watched closely, wanted to believe that this transformation, from panic to process, meant resolution was close behind. Investigators spoke with confidence. They used words like leads, patterns, and working theory. They asked questions that suggested control. Who was last with the child? Had there been arguments at home? Any history of running away? The questions were logical, professional. They also felt strangely disconnected from the reality of what the town was living through. The first assumption was movement. The children must have gone somewhere. They must have been taken elsewhere. Roads became the focus. Highways, intersections, bus stations. Officers questioned anyone who had passed through town around the time of each disappearance. Truck drivers, salesmen, seasonal workers, outsiders with unfamiliar faces, and no emotional ties to the place. It made sense. Danger came from outside. It always had in stories and statistics. The town accepted this logic easily because it matched what they already believed. Suspicion flowed outward like water following gravity. Search zones expanded beyond familiar ground. Nearby towns were notified. Flyers were printed and distributed. Faces of missing children stared back from bulletin boards and shop windows, frozen in a moment of happiness that now felt unbearable to look at for too long. What didn't happen was just as important as what did. Investigators didn't linger in the spaces that felt too normal. They didn't question the routines that had always existed. They didn't interrogate familiarity. They moved through the town like visitors, not residents, following models designed for places where danger announced itself loudly and left evidence behind. But this town was quiet, too quiet. Homes were searched with permission, but only briefly, politely. Neighbors stood aside, offended at the idea that scrutiny might fall on them. These were good people, known people, people with histories that stretched back generations. The idea that harm could originate there felt not just unlikely, but insulting. So the investigation learned the town's manners quickly. Leads that pointed inward were softened, redirected, or quietly dropped, not out of malice, but out of deference. Officers sensed the unspoken rules and adjusted accordingly. This was a community that valued harmony, and they did not want to be the ones to fracture it. The town, in turn, wanted answers, but only the kind that preserved its identity. As weeks passed, the investigation grew more complex and less effective. Files thickened. Timelines overlapped. The absence of evidence became its own obstacle. There were no ransom notes, no eyewitness accounts, no physical traces strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Each failure added weight to the air. The presence of law enforcement, once comforting, began to feel like a reminder of helplessness. Their continued presence meant one thing above all else. Nothing had been solved. Families oscillated between gratitude and frustration. They answered the same questions repeatedly, reliving the last moments they'd seen their children. What were they wearing? Who did they speak to? Did anything seem unusual? The answers never changed. The outcome never did either. Some parents began to feel invisible, as though their grief had been absorbed into the machinery of the investigation, processed and filed away. Meetings were held. Updates were given. Sympathy was expressed. But progress remained elusive. Behind closed doors, tension grew. The longer the investigation continued without results, the more pressure mounted to find a narrative that made sense. Runaways, abductions, trafficking. Each theory was explored, then abandoned. None fit cleanly. None explained everything. The idea of a single perpetrator emerged briefly, then dissolved under the weight of disbelief. A stranger living among them? Watching? Waiting? It felt too dramatic, too cinematic to be real. The town rejected it instinctively. Instead, the investigation fragmented. Each disappearance became its own puzzle rather than part of a whole. Resources were stretched thin. Attention shifted depending on the most recent loss. Older cases began to cool before they had ever warmed. Mistakes were made, though no one would call them that out loud. Timelines blurred. Early witness statements were not preserved with urgency. Some potential evidence was dismissed as irrelevant, later to be reconsidered when it was already too late. The investigation was not negligent, but it was human, shaped by assumptions it didn't know it was making. And those assumptions all pointed in the same direction, outward. As months passed, the town began to feel as though it was being searched endlessly without ever being seen. Officers walked the streets, but they didn't feel the weight that hung there at night. They didn't notice how people avoided certain houses without knowing why, how conversations stopped abruptly when someone approached. The town itself held information, but not in the form of facts. It held it in memory, in instinct, in things people almost said and then swallowed back down. But investigations don't run on almosts. Pressure came from above as well. Regional authorities wanted results. Media attention flickered briefly, then moved on when no dramatic developments emerged. Without evidence, the story lacked momentum. The town was left to sit, with its fear largely alone. Eventually, the number of active officers dwindled, not because the case was closed, but because resources were finite and leads were exhausted. The investigation entered a new phase, one marked not by action, but by waiting. Waiting for a break, waiting for a mistake, waiting for time to loosen something that pressure could not. For the families, this felt like abandonment. For the town, it felt like confirmation of its worst fear, that no one knew how to fix what had been broken. The investigation had looked everywhere it knew how to look. It had searched forests and fields, roads and records. It had chased strangers and shadows. What it had not done, what it could not bring itself to do, was look closely at the familiar. The town remained intact on the surface. No arrests, no public accusations, no rupture. And that, in a way, became the quiet victory of the moment. Because, while nothing had been solved, nothing had been exposed either. The danger, whatever it was, remained unnamed, unacknowledged, free to exist in spaces left untouched by scrutiny. And as the investigation slowed, the town was left with chilling realization it could barely articulate. All the searching had changed nothing. Whatever had taken the children was still there, still unseen, still close. After the searches quieted and the questions slowed, what remained was not peace, but hollow kind of waiting. The town did not move on. It learned how to exist around absence. 17 spaces where children should have became part of the landscape, as fixed and undeniable as empty lots or abandoned buildings. Each missing child lingered differently, not as a face on a flyer anymore, but as a disruption in routine. A chair that stayed empty, a bedroom door that was never open again, a name that stopped being spoken because it hurt too much to say it without expecting an answer. The town tried, at first, to remember them properly. There were vigils, candles lining sidewalks, photographs taped to windows. People gathered in silence, holding each other, convinced that collective grief might somehow summon resolution. But memory is heavy when it has nowhere to go. Over time, the rituals faded, candles burned out, posters curled and fell. The town did not forget the children, but it stopped knowing what to do with the remembering. Grief without direction has a way of turning inward. Parents carried it differently. Some refused to change anything. Bedrooms stayed exactly as they had been the last morning their child left. Clothes folded and refolded, never worn. Beds made daily, as if habit alone might keep hope alive. Others erased the evidence as quickly as they could. Toys were given away. Rooms repainted. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Looking at reminders felt like reopening a wound that never closed. Both choices came with guilt. There were parents who replayed their last conversations endlessly. Every instruction, every moment of impatience. Words spoken too sharply. Warnings not given. They learned to torture themselves with hypotheticals. If only they'd left earlier. If only they'd walked them home. If only they'd noticed something that, at the time, felt ordinary. Ordinary became unbearable. The town avoided the families at first, not out of indifference, but out of helplessness. People didn't know what to say. Every sentence felt wrong. Comfort felt insulting. Silence felt cruel. So they hovered awkwardly, then slowly pulled back, giving space that felt more like distance. Grief isolated as effectively as walls. Some families stayed, rooted themselves in the place that had taken everything from them. Leaving felt like another loss, another betrayal. Others packed up quietly and disappeared from the town story. unable to walk streets that echoed with footsteps that never came back. Their departures left more gaps, more reminders. Children who remained felt the weight too. They learned about absence early. They learned how quickly playmates could become stories adults whispered about. Survivors' guilt settled in places it didn't belong, convincing them that simply growing up was something to apologize for. Classrooms felt different. Attendance lists carried names that were never called. Teachers hesitated before speaking them, as if saying them out loud might reopen wounds they weren't trained to handle. Playgrounds emptied, laughter thinned, childhood shortened. The missing children became a collective presence, felt everywhere, seen nowhere. They were remembered in fragments. Someone's laugh, someone's stubborn streak, someone's habit of walking too close to the road. But those fragments never assembled into a full picture again. The town told itself stories to cope. Some imagined the children alive somewhere else, grown now, unaware of the void they'd left behind. Others clung to the belief that answers would come eventually, that time would reveal what fear had hidden. Time instead buried things. Years passed, and with them came a quiet agreement. The children would not be spoken about unless necessary. Not because they were forgotten, but because speaking about them invited pain with no relief. Their names became sacred and dangerous all at once. The town learned how to speak around the truth. Anniversaries were hardest. Dates that arrived uninvited, carrying memories no one wanted to revisit but couldn't escape. Some families marked them privately. Others refused to acknowledge them at all. Both choices hurt. The absence never softened. It simply became familiar. New families moved in eventually, drawn by low prices and quiet streets. They were told pieces of the story, usually softened. Children had gone missing once, a long time ago. No one really knew what happened. It was tragic, but it was over. It was never over. Long-time residents watched newcomers with a complicated mix of relief and resentment. Relief that life was continuing. Resentment that it could. The town itself seemed to remember. Certain places felt heavier. Certain routes were avoided without explanation. People learned where not to linger, where not to let children wander, though few could articulate why. The children who were never found aged only in memory. Their photographs stayed young while the town grew older around them. Parents aged into strangers, their faces lined by a grief that never relaxed its grip. What hurt most was not the lack of answers, but the lack of endings. There was no moment to close the chapter, no truth to organize the pain around. Grief remained scattered, unresolved, impossible to file away. The town carried the missing children like a shared secret it never agreed to keep. They were present in every silence, every cautious glance, every rule that followed. They shaped how the town raised its children long after their own were gone. They lived in warnings and curfews, in the careful way parents held hands crossing streets. Even those born years later felt it. They grew up with a sense that something had happened here, something unspoken but powerful enough to shape behavior. They learned to accept boundaries without knowing their origin. The missing children became a lesson the town could never quite articulate. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They did not haunt hallways or whisper at night. They haunted in absence, in the way the town flinched at laughter too loud, in the way people checked clocks obsessively when children were late. They were the question that never stopped being asked. And as time stretched on, as hope dimmed but never fully died, the town settled into a version of itself shaped by loss. A place that functioned, endured, survived, but never healed. The children were never found, but they were never gone either. They remained woven into the town's identity, a quiet, aching presence beneath everything that followed, waiting, patiently, for a truth that would one day disturb the ground they'd been buried beneath. Time moved forward because it had no choice. Calendars flipped. Seasons repeated themselves with mechanical indifference. Winters came and went, softening memories only on the surface. On paper, decades passed. In reality, the town remained anchored to a single year it could never leave behind. 1973 did not recede into history here. It stretched. It seeped into everything that followed. The streets aged, but the fear did not. Houses were repainted. Stores changed ownership. Children grew up married, had children of their own. Yet beneath these visible markers of progress, the town existed in a suspended state, forever bracing for something that had already happened. People learned how to live with that tension. It became background noise, like the hum of electricity or the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. You didn't notice it until it stopped, and it never stopped. Those who had been children during the disappearances carried the weight differently. They grew up knowing what it felt like to be counted obsessively, to feel watched not with affection but with fear. Some internalized it, becoming cautious, anxious adults who trusted nothing without proof. Others rebelled against it, chasing danger as if to prove the town had been wrong to be afraid. None of them escaped unmarked. Survivors' guilt took root early. Children asked themselves questions no child should have to ask. Why them and not me? What was different about the days they were taken versus the days I was not? The randomness was unbearable. So they searched for meaning where none existed. Parents aged in slow, uneven ways. Grief carved lines into faces that smiled often but never fully relaxed. Some parents stayed in the town, refusing to be driven out by pain. They became living memorials, their presence a quiet reminder of what had been lost. Others left, unable to breathe in a place where every corner held memory. Their departure didn't ease the town's burden. It compounded it. Absence stacked upon absence. The town adapted in practical ways. Security systems appeared where none had existed before. Streetlights multiplied. Schools revised policies. The freedoms that once defined childhood here were replaced by caution. Children were walked, supervised, scheduled. What had once been trust became control. Yet even as safeguards increased, anxiety never receded. The measures felt performative, more symbolic than effective. They existed to reassure, not to resolve. Conversations about the disappearances became rare and stilted. People referred to that time or what happened back then, without elaboration. Details blurred. Stories shifted. Memory became unreliable, shaped by repetition and avoidance. Silence settled in thick and institutional. New generations grew up sensing that silence without understanding it. They learned that certain questions made adults uncomfortable, that certain topics ended conversations abruptly. They absorbed the lesson quickly. Some things were better left alone. The town became skilled at forgetting just enough to function. Anniversaries passed quietly. There were no official ceremonies, no plaques, no public acknowledgments. The absence of memorials wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. To commemorate would be to reopen wounds a town had spent years trying to close. But wounds don't close when they're ignored. They scar, and scars change how a body moves. The town's movements became cautious, constrained. Growth slowed. Investment lagged. People described the place as sleepy or stuck in time, without realizing how accurate that was. Every now and then, an outsider would ask about the disappearances. A journalist, a student, a curious newcomer. The town's response was predictable, brief, vague, defensive. They spoke as if the story belonged to the past, even as it shaped their present. There was an unspoken fear that too much attention might wake something. As years turned into decades, hope thinned but did not vanish entirely. It transformed. Parents no longer waited by windows. They waited quietly, privately, in ways that allowed them to survive. Some held on to the idea that answers would come after they were gone, that truth had a longer timeline than justice. Others abandoned hope altogether, finding it too cruel to sustain. The physical landscape bore the marks of time, but also of restraint. Certain areas remained untouched. Empty lots stayed empty. Projects were proposed, then quietly shelved. It wasn't superstition exactly, more a collective reluctance to disturb what lay beneath. The ground itself seemed complicit, holding secrets tightly. Those who remembered 1973 directly spoke of it less as they aged, not because the memories faded, but because they grew heavier. The effort required to carry them became too much. The town learned to exist in layers. On the surface, it was functional, polite, unremarkable. Beneath that, it was cautious, guarded, shaped by something unresolved. And deeper still, it held a tension that never released, like a held breath. Time passed. but the town never exhaled. Children born long after the disappearances inherited rules without explanations, curfews justified by just in case, warnings issued without context. They grew up with a sense that safety was conditional, that something unseen could always interrupt life. They were right. The past did not announce itself. It waited. It allowed the town to believe it had moved on, that enough time had passed for wounds to heal naturally. But time had not healed anything. It had only buried it deeper. And buried things have a way of resurfacing, especially when disturbed. The town didn't know it yet, but its long, careful silence was nearing an end. The year that had never truly ended was about to reach forward and make itself known again. 1973 was done waiting. The proposal arrived dressed in practicality. A redevelopment plan, an answer to stagnation. On paper, it made sense. Jobs, revitalization, progress. The kind of thing towns like this were supposed to welcome after years of being quietly passed over. Officials spoke about moving forward, about not letting the past define the future. But the moment the location was announced, something tightened. The land sat on the edge of town, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its history. An open stretch that had resisted change for decades. Grass grew unevenly there. Nothing stayed long. People passed by without lingering, rarely stopping long enough to ask why the space felt the way it did. Most couldn't have explained their discomfort if asked. They only knew they didn't like it. When the plan was made public, resistance surfaced quietly at first. Not protests, not outrage, just hesitation. Questions asked more slowly than usual. Long pauses in meetings. People glancing at one another instead of the officials speaking at the front of the room. Someone asked if another site had been considered. Someone else mentioned environmental concerns, though none had ever been raised before. A few residents spoke about the importance of preserving open space, even though preservation had never been a priority. The objections didn't align. They weren't cohesive, but they all pointed to the same unspoken truth. The town did not want that ground disturbed. No one said why. To articulate it would require naming something that had lived safely in silence for years. It would require admitting that the land felt charged, that it carried weight. And to say that out loud would sound irrational, even to the people who believed it most. So instead, they spoke in abstractions. The officials listened politely. They nodded. They made notes. They explained timelines and permits and reassurances. They reminded the town that nothing would change unless they allowed it to. Eventually, practicality won. It always does, given enough time. The project was approved. The day construction equipment arrived, the town noticed, not because it was loud or disruptive, but because it felt intrusive. Machines where there had only ever been space. Movement where there had been stillness. People slowed their cars as they passed. Some stopped entirely, pretending to check messages or adjust mirrors, just to watch. The machines cut clean lines into the earth, methodical and indifferent. They did not hesitate. They did not remember. The town did. Those who had lived there long enough felt a familiar unease settle into their chests. A sensation they hadn't felt in years. Not so clearly. The same tightening. The same sense that something had been set in motion without consent. Older residents avoided the area altogether. Younger ones lingered, drawn by curiosity they didn't fully understand. They stood at fences, watching dirt being peeled back layer by layer, unaware of why the sight made them uneasy. At night, the town felt different. Sounds carried farther. The low hum of equipment echoed in ways it hadn't during the day. Some residents reported trouble sleeping, though they blamed it on stress, on age, on coincidence. Dreams grew restless. There were conversations people had with themselves and no one else. Questions they didn't voice. Why that spot? Why now? Why did it feel wrong in a way that couldn't be explained? The past stirred quietly, not with images or memories, but with instinct. Construction continued. Schedules were met. Foundations were measured. The ground resisted in small ways. Unexpected density. Soil that didn't behave as predicted, but nothing alarming enough to stop the work. Until it did. It happened mid-morning, under clear skies. No storm. No warning. Just a sudden halt. A machine stopped moving. An operator climbed down, confusion written across his face. He gestured towards something in the trench, something that didn't belong there. At first, it was treated as debris, old material, a remnant of something long forgotten. Work paused briefly as supervisors were called over. Then the tone changed. Voices lowered. Movement slowed. Phones appeared. Someone stepped back from the trench as if instinctively, as though proximity alone was dangerous. The town didn't hear about it immediately. Information moved more slowly now, weighed down by caution. But word spread the way it always had, through glances, through half-sentences, through the unmistakable shift in behavior. Construction stopped for the day. The next morning, it didn't resume. Officials arrived. Then more officials. Areas were cordoned off. Tape appeared where none had been the day before. The site became something else entirely, no longer a place of progress, but of interruption. The town gathered at a distance. People stood in clusters, pretending not to stare. Conversations were hushed, fragmented. Everyone felt it. The past had been disturbed, and it was not pleased. Those who remembered 1973 felt it most sharply, a sensation like recognition, like a door they had spent decades keeping shut had been nudged open, just enough to let something breathe. They didn't need details to understand the gravity, the sudden seriousness, the absence of explanation, the way officials avoided eye contact. Younger residents sensed it too, though without context. They watched their parents grow pale, saw expressions they had never seen before. Fear, yes, but also something else. Validation. As if a long-held anxiety had finally found its shape. The town held its breath. Rumors surged, then stalled. No one wanted to be wrong. No one wanted to say too much. People spoke in questions instead of statements. Did you hear? Do you think it's connected? Could it be? The site remained sealed. Work crews were dismissed indefinitely. The project timeline dissolved overnight. And with that dissolution came a realization the town had not been prepared for. The ground had kept it secret for decades. And now, it had decided to give something back. Not all at once. Not clearly. But enough to change everything. The town didn't know yet what had been found. Not precisely. But they knew it was enough to reopen wounds that had never truly healed. Enough to pull the past out of abstraction and into the present. Progress had forced the issue. The silence that had protected everyone, for better or worse, was no longer intact. Something beneath the town had been waiting, and it had finally been touched. The confirmation did not arrive in a dramatic announcement. There was no press conference, no immediate explanation offered to the people who stood at a distance, watching the site with a mixture of dread and expectation. Instead, the truth emerged the way it had always existed here, slowly, reluctantly, through silence that suddenly felt heavier than before. The first official vehicles arrived before noon, unmarked, purposeful. They parked with intention, blocking sightlines rather than inviting curiosity. Workers were instructed to leave. Equipment was shut down and left exactly where it stood, as if even machines understood they should not move any further. Those closest to the site noticed the shift immediately. The body language changed, the way people spoke, the way they stopped speaking altogether. What had been a construction project a day before was now something else entirely, a place where rules changed. The ground itself told the story long before anyone else did. It wasn't just dirt anymore. It was layered, disturbed in ways that did not match natural erosion or forgotten foundations. The soil gave resistance, then yielded, revealing textures that didn't belong to construction debris or buried refuse. Something older, something deliberate. Experts were called in. Quietly, carefully, they examined the site with reverence rather than urgency. Every movement was measured, every decision debated. The town did not know who these people were, but it recognized the gravity in how they worked. Word spread anyway. It always does. People began to remember things they hadn't thought about in years. The way the land had always felt different. How nothing ever stayed built there. How children had been warned, without explanation, not to play too close to that area. Memories rose uninvited. rearranging themselves into something that felt disturbingly coherent. The first clear indication came when officials confirmed that the site would remain closed indefinitely. That was enough. Speculation became unavoidable. Conversations that had once been whispered were now spoken openly, though still without certainty. People used careful language, cushioning every sentence with qualifiers. It might be. They're saying it could be. If it's what we think it is. No one wanted to be the first to say it plainly. Those who had waited decades for answers felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread at what might finally be confirmed. Relief that the waiting, endless, formless waiting, might finally have shape. For the families, the days that followed were unbearable. Officials reached out privately. Meetings were scheduled behind closed doors. Conversations were held that no parent ever imagines having. Some families had not heard from authorities in years. Now, suddenly, they were being asked to come in, to sit down, to listen. The town watched these meetings happen without hearing what was said. Cars parked outside familiar buildings. People entered and exited with expressions that said more than words ever could. Some left in silence. Some left shaking. Some did not leave for hours. Whatever had been found beneath the ground was no longer abstract. The process was slow by necessity. Every inch of earth was treated as evidence. Time ceased to matter. Precision became everything. The ground gave up its contents reluctantly, as though it had been instructed to keep them safe for as long as possible. When confirmation finally came, it did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments. Officials acknowledged that the discovery was human in origin. That alone shifted the town's emotional center of gravity. The possibility became real. Terrifyingly so. It was no longer a rumor or a fear passed down through generations. It was physical, documented, undeniable. More details followed, cautiously released. The remains were old, decades old. The timeline aligned too closely to be ignored. The town felt something snap into place, a grim recognition settling over everything. This was not a coincidence. This was not unrelated. The ground had not simply held something. It had held someone. And then, horrifyingly, more than one. The scale of the discovery expanded with each passing day. What had initially seemed singular revealed itself to be part of something larger. Layers of disturbance. Patterns that suggested repetition rather than accident. The town struggled to process the idea that the answers it had waited for were not going to be simple. That resolution would not arrive as a clean narrative, but as a reckoning. Families were notified privately, but news has a way of escaping containment. The town learned quickly that the number of remains matched too closely with the number of missing children to be dismissed. 17 was no longer just a number etched into memory. It was being excavated. People who had once begged for answers now found themselves hesitating, unsure they wanted to know everything. Grief returned with force that surprised even those who had lived with it for decades. It was different this time. Sharper, more specific. No longer about absence, but about confirmation. About imagining what had happened in the space between disappearance and burial. The town resisted those images instinctively. No one wanted gore. No one wanted detail. The horror was not in how the children died, but in the fact that they had been there all along beneath the town's feet, beneath picnics and passing cars, beneath years of silence. Officials attempted to maintain control over the narrative. They spoke carefully, emphasizing procedure, respect, and ongoing investigation. They urged patience. They reminded everyone that answers would come in time. But patience had been exhausted long ago. The most unsettling realization came not from what was found, but from where it was found. The location mattered. It forced questions that could no longer be avoided. Why there? Why so close? Why unnoticed for so long? The town had lived above the truth for decades. People revisited old memories with new eyes. They thought about routes children used to walk, about adults who had seemed unusually attentive, unusually helpful, about moments that had felt strange in retrospect, but had been dismissed at the time. The past reorganized itself around this new information, and it was not kind. As the excavation continued, the town became suspended in a state of collective reckoning. Schools adjusted schedules. Businesses closed early. People gathered not to speculate, but to sit together as if proximity alone could steady them. Media attention returned, heavier this time. Cameras appeared. Reporters asked questions that felt invasive, even when they were necessary. The town bristled at the scrutiny, protective of its grief, resentful of being defined by its darkest chapter. But the story could no longer be contained. Experts confirmed what many already knew in their bones. The remains were consistent with the children who had disappeared. The timeline fit. The evidence aligned. The ground had kept it secret, but not perfectly. Enough traces remained to tell the story time had tried to erase. Families were given choices about identification, about involvement, about how much they wanted to know. There were no right decisions, only survivable ones. Some parents wanted every detail. Others wanted none. Both reactions were met with understanding. The town had learned, painfully, that grief does not follow rules. Memorials began to appear spontaneously. Flowers placed at the perimeter of the site, notes tucked into fences, names written carefully on paper and left where the ground could see them. The town did not wait for permission to mourn. The children were no longer missing. They had been found. That truth brought no relief. Instead, it deepened everything. It confirmed the worst fears while answering questions no one had truly wanted answered. The mystery that had haunted the town for decades was finally taking shape, but shape did not equal peace. As the excavation neared completion, one thing became clear beyond doubt. This had not been an accident. It had not been random. The pattern was deliberate, sustained, hidden with care, which meant there was another truth waiting beneath this one. Someone had known. Someone had been close enough to hide this for decades. The ground had spoken, but it was not finished telling its story. And the town, forced at last to listen, realized that what had been uncovered was not just a burial site. It was a mirror, one that reflected not only what had been done, but what had been ignored. The secret had surfaced, and it was about to change everything. Once the shock settled into something like grim clarity, the town found itself facing a question it had spent decades avoiding. Not what had happened, because that was becoming devastatingly clear, but how it had been allowed to happen at all. The evidence did not point outward anymore. It pointed back toward the town itself, like an accusation that could no longer be redirected. Investigators began reconstructing timelines with the benefit of hindsight, and what emerged was not a story of invisibility, but of proximity. The children had not been taken far. They had not been transported across borders or vanished into some unknowable elsewhere. They had been taken nearby. Familiar paths, familiar places, familiar hands. That realization landed heavily, reshaping memories people had once trusted. Old witness statements were revisited. Offhand remarks that had seemed insignificant at the time now carried weight. A neighbor who had mentioned seeing a child with someone they recognized but couldn't quite place. A teacher who had noticed a pattern of absences just before the disappearances. A parent who had felt uneasy about a particular interaction but dismissed it as paranoia. Each detail had existed in isolation, harmless on its own. Together, they formed something unmistakable. The truth had not been hidden expertly. It had been overlooked willingly. As files were reopened, a name surfaced. Not all at once, not publicly, but gradually, in careful conversations behind closed doors. Someone who had been known, trusted, someone whose presence had been so ordinary, it blended into the background of daily life. The town recoiled at the implication. This was not a stranger, not an outsider who passed through and vanished again. This was someone who had attended community events, exchanged greetings, offered help, someone who had existed comfortably within the town's shared narrative of safety. The idea felt obscene. People reacted defensively at first. They questioned the process, the motives, the conclusions. They insisted on caution, on not rushing to judgment. Those instincts, once admirable, now served as shields. But the evidence did not bend. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. The children had been taken from predictable places, at predictable times. Moments when supervision was assumed but not confirmed. When trust filled the gaps where vigilance should have been. The town began to understand something deeply unsettling. The disappearances had relied on trust to function. It wasn't just that someone had exploited access. It was that the town had provided it freely, repeatedly, without question. Neighbors revisited old memories with growing discomfort. Conversations they'd had, moments they'd brushed off, instances where something felt wrong, but not wrong enough to challenge openly. Why hadn't they spoken up? The answer was as painful as it was simple. Because speaking up would have meant disrupting the story they believed about themselves. Accusation felt more dangerous than silence. The realization spread unevenly. Some accepted it immediately, crushed by guilt they didn't know how to carry. Others resisted fiercely, clinging to alternative explanations, to the hope that the truth might still be external, impersonal. But denial requires energy, and energy had been spent. As more information became unavoidable, the town's collective self-image fractured. The idea that they had been victims alone no longer held. They had been participants too, not in action, but in inaction. No one had pulled a trigger. No one had dug a grave. But many had looked away. That distinction offered little comfort. Families of the missing children were forced into an impossible position. On one hand, they finally had answers. On the other, those answers implicated people they had once known, maybe even loved. The betrayal cut deeper than any stranger ever could have. Some parents remembered accepting help, rides home, supervision offered casually without suspicion. They replayed those moments endlessly, wondering if the truth had brushed past them unnoticed. The guilt was merciless. The town tried to draw lines between those responsible and those who were merely unaware, but the lines blurred quickly. Responsibility was diffuse, shared, uncomfortable. It lived in culture, in habit, in assumptions passed down without question. Trust had not been misplaced accidentally. It had been cultivated deliberately, rewarded socially. People who raised concerns back then, quiet, hesitant concerns, were remembered now with a different clarity. The way their doubts had been minimized, the way they had been encouraged not to stir trouble, not to cast shadows where none were wanted. The town had protected itself from discomfort at the cost of truth. That realization reshaped every interaction. Old friendships felt fragile. Conversations grew tense, loaded with unspoken accusations. Who knew what and when? Who suspected, even faintly? Who chose not to ask? The town began to fracture along invisible lines. Some demanded accountability, not just for the perpetrator, but for institutions that had failed to act decisively, for investigations that had followed the path of least resistance, for leadership that had prioritized calm over confrontation. Others pushed back, arguing that hindsight made everything clearer than it had been, that no one could have known, that blaming the past served no purpose now. Both sides were right, and neither found peace in that. The most devastating truth was not that someone had done this. It was that the town had been close enough to stop it. That knowledge settled like a weight no one could lift. It reshaped grief into something sharper, more corrosive. Grief mixed with responsibility becomes something else entirely, something that does not fade with time. The idea of a monster lurking unseen was replaced by something far more disturbing: familiarity. The understanding that harm can wear friendly faces, speak kindly, exist comfortably within community norms. That lesson did not stay contained in the past. It altered how people related to one another in the present. Trust, once freely given, became conditional, cautious. Relationships cooled. The town grew quieter, more guarded than ever before. The truth had not healed the wound. It had exposed it. As investigators moved closer to formal conclusions, the town braced itself for public acknowledgement. Statements would be made. Names would be spoken. The story would be fixed into record, no longer malleable or avoidable. People feared that moment almost as much as they had feared the unknown, because once the truth was spoken plainly, there would be no refuge in ambiguity, no room for comforting narratives, no way to pretend that the town had simply been unlucky. The story would be one of proximity, of mischances, of silence mistaken for safety. And as the town stood on the edge of that reckoning, one final, inescapable understanding took hold. The ground had not only revealed what was buried beneath it, it had revealed what the town had buried inside itself. And that truth, unlike bones or evidence, could not be reinterred. It would live here now, with everyone. When the legal process finally caught up with the discovery, it arrived with a strange, hollow weight. Arrests were made, confessions recorded, and evidence presented in court, but the victories felt muted. Justice had a procedural rhythm now, hearings, testimonies, verdicts, but it could not reach back into the decades of absence, the stolen years, the unspoken fear that had seeped into every corner of the town. Families attended proceedings, some stoically, some trembling. Faces long hardened by grief softened momentarily in the presence of acknowledgement, but the relief was short-lived. Answers arrived, but they were fragments of a larger, unfixable story. The perpetrator was known, name confronted, but naming did not undo. Conviction did not restore what was lost. The courtroom offered clarity without comfort. It validated what the town had suspected, what parents had felt in their bones for years, but it also reinforced the cruel reality. Accountability could be enforced on one individual, but the emotional damage stretched far beyond any sentence. Every parent carried decades of unanswered questions, and even now, the questions outnumber the answers. Outside the courtroom, the town moved quietly, unwilling or unable to celebrate. Streets that held the weight of fear for generations remained subdued. People nodded to one another with a cautious acknowledgement of shared suffering, but they did not smile. For all the legal closure, the emotional closure was a different, far more elusive thing. Some families found solace in small, private acts, a visit to the site, a quiet memorial, a moment of remembering the children for who they were, not how they were lost. Others struggled with anger, frustration at the slow wheels of justice, at decades stolen before anything could be done. And yet the town persisted. Life continued, though altered irrevocably. The legal resolution was a milestone, a form of recognition, but it was not an ending. Justice had arrived too late to save anyone, and in its arrival, it reminded everyone the price exacted not only by the crimes themselves, but by the years of silence, denial, and fear that allowed them to endure. The town that had once moved through life with an unspoken rhythm now felt slower, heavier, as the weight of memory had settled over every street and building. Time had passed, decades had come and gone, but the discovery and the revelations that followed had reshaped the place in ways that no redevelopment plan, no reconstruction effort could undo. The children who had been lost in 1973 were no longer missing a name, but their absence remained tangible, etched into the town's very identity. Residents walked familiar streets with a cautious awareness, noticing details they had once overlooked. A faded fence, a hollow tree, a path through the woods that was slightly overgrown. Each element carried a ghost of the past. Those who had been children themselves during the disappearances carried the memories like fragile glass, careful not to shatter them, careful not to let anyone else drop them. They recognized the same weight in the eyes of new generations who had grown up in a town now forever marked. Memorials appeared quietly, small, understated markers at the edges of parks or at the perimeter of the land where the discovery had been made. Flowers, photographs, candles placed in reverent clusters. Some families returned to the site frequently, not for spectacle, but for connection, to honor what had been taken, to feel the children's presence, if only in memory. The town's daily life had adjusted around absence and recognition. Schools incorporated lessons about awareness and vigilance in subtle ways. Playgrounds were supervised with care that bordered on ritual, a quiet acknowledgement that safety was never guaranteed, that the past had left permanent instruction. Children learned to respect boundaries, not because they had experienced the horrors themselves, but because the town's collective memory whispered warnings in every corner. Adults, too, changed in ways that were both visible and invisible. Friendships were tempered by caution. Conversations carried subtext. Trust was measured carefully. People learned that ordinary familiarity could conceal extraordinary harm. The lessons of 1973 were encoded into the town's culture. Watch, remember, question, and never assume safety is permanent. Even as life continued, shops opened, cars passed through familiar streets, the season cycled. The emotional landscape remained transformed. Laughter existed, but it was quieter, more deliberate. Joy was permitted, but carefully framed, tempered by the knowledge that absence could arrive without warning. The town had learned painfully, to live alongside memory. The children themselves, though gone, became present in unexpected ways. Stories of who they were before they vanished were shared cautiously, but often. Parents and siblings spoke of habits, of laughter, of little details once mundane, but now sacred. These recollections became a kind of shared mythology, preserving identity against the erasure imposed by decades of uncertainty. The town, in remembering, kept them alive. There was a strange resilience in the community. While the discovery had brought grief and outrage, it had also forged a tentative cohesion. People gathered not to relive trauma, but to honor survival. The survival of memory, of acknowledgement, of the possibility that a town could face its darkest truths and still persist. Visitors occasionally arrived, curious or scholarly, drawn by the story that had spread far beyond the town's borders. Some came seeking sensational detail, but most were quietly struck by the atmosphere, the careful respect woven into everyday life. They noted the memorials, the vigilance, the deliberate quiet, and left with a sense that this place carried a burden it could not abandon. And at night, the town felt it most sharply. The streets were still, the shadows longer. Windows reflected lives lived in careful observation. Those who had endured the loss of children decades before would pause, noticing the subtle reminders of absence that had become part of their subconscious. An empty swing moving the wind, a lone bicycle leaning against a fence, a soft echo of laughter imagined in the distance. These reminders were painful but grounding. They affirmed that what had been lost had not been forgotten. The legacy of 1973 lingered not as horror alone, but as a quiet insistence on presence. The children who had been taken were woven into the town's consciousness, not merely as victims, but as part of its collective identity. Their memory informed decisions, shaped behavior, and held the community accountable to itself. Families, for the first time in decades, found moments of peace, though never full closure. They could acknowledge the truth, confront the absence, and honor what remained in memory. The town collectively moved through mourning, acknowledgement, and adaptation, recognizing that survival was not merely about life continued, but about truth confronted and preserved. Even as development continued elsewhere, even as new faces entered the town, the legacy of the children persisted. They were present in quiet acts. Flowers left a forgotten corner, a candle flickering at dusk, a whispered name in conversation, a pause before letting a child wander down a street. The town's heart beat with their absence as much as with its own life, and in that rhythm lay both sorrow and resilience. The children, though taken, still lived here, not in the world of flesh, but in memory, in stories, in the careful attention paid to every shadow, every corner, every sound. The town had been irrevocably changed, but had learned to carry that change with dignity. In honoring them, it also honored itself, its capacity to endure, to remember, and to face a past it could never forget. And so the town remained, quiet yet aware, scarred but resilient, living alongside the memory of 17 children whose presence would never fully leave, whose absence would never be complete, whose story had become inseparable from the place they had called home.